Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first Visual Voices of Spring 2021. My name is Mara Glasscock, and I am the House Manager at Center for the Arts. For those of you who would benefit from a visual description, I am a Caucasian woman with brown hair. I'm wearing a black turtleneck, and my virtual background is our concert hall auditorium. I also want to take a moment to introduce some features on your Zoom toolbar. If you would benefit from closed captioning, there is a button with 2 capital C's. If you click on that, subtitles should start to appear at the bottom of your screen. Also on your toolbar is a Q&A button. If you click on that, a Q&A box will appear. And at the end of the presentation tonight, you'll have a chance to type your questions into that Q&A box. There is also a chat box, and that's for you to say hi and be social, but please do remember to type your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jeffrey Kenny, who is the Associate Curator of Mason Exhibitions.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Kenny. I'm Associate Curator with Mason Exhibitions at the School of Art at George Mason University. For the audio captioning purposes, and for those of you that have trouble seeing me, I am a white man of European descent with brown hair and a beard, wearing a blue shirt and sitting in front of a light gray wall. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to start by acknowledging the Monacan Nation, including the Manahoe people, the traditional owners of the land and waters upon which George Mason University stands, and including the area of Northwestern Virginia, from where I am speaking to you tonight. On behalf of the university, I also want to take a moment of recognition and compassion for all those who have been negatively affected by the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, and to express our solidarity with our Black and brown faculty, staff, students, friends, and all people who have experienced racism and other forms of injustice. As a community, we affirm our commitment to social justice and creating a culture of excellence, inclusion, and accessibility. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Wendy Red Star. Raised on the Apsáalooke Crow Reservation in Montana, Wendy Red Star's work is informed by her cultural heritage, her engagement with many forms of creative expression, including photography, sculpture, video, fiber arts, and performance. An avid researcher of archives and historical narratives, Red Star seeks to incorporate and recast her research, offering new and unexpected perspectives in work that is at once inquisitive, witty, and unsettling. Among a number of noteworthy recent exhibitions and professional activities, Red Star is the subject of a current solo exhibition at the Joslin Museum in Omaha, Nebraska, and was the guest editor of the fall 2020 Aperture magazine edition titled Native America, which is the magazine's first edition devoted entirely to Native American artists and photographers. Red Star holds a BFA from Montana State University Bozeman and an MFA in sculpture from the University of California, Los Angeles. She lives and works currently in Portland, Oregon. And with that, welcome Wendy.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you to everyone who is tuning in. A visual reference, I am half Apsáalooke and half white. I am wearing a gray plaid blazer and a black shirt with a necklace, and I have black hair. And I'm truly honored to be spending time with all of you tuning in to hear a little bit more about my practice. And I want to thank Jeff and Don for inviting me to be part of the Visual Voices lecture at George Mason University as part of the School of Art. I am excited to share my presentation. I've changed it up a little bit, especially during sort of this virtual time where I've been giving quite a bit of lectures and things are being recorded. And I thought, well, you know, if someone wants to Google me, they'll see my lecture. And I felt like it's time for a little bit of a change. So what I'm going to be presenting to you tonight is a few different projects and going into specific details on those projects. All of them have several different layers to them. And then I would like to end with sharing some new works that will be coming out or that are just recently have come out. So let's get started. The first project I want to talk about is an exhibition that I had a few years ago at Q Foundation, and it's spelled CUE. And I love to talk about the Q Foundation. It's a great resource for artists and curators. As an artist, you can apply to the Q Foundation to have an exhibition, and they will produce a small catalog and pair you up with a curator. And you have a solo exhibition, and there's a lot of support. And if you're a curator, you can also apply to have a show and curate an exhibition. And there's also a catalog with that. So it's a really wonderful resource with a great board. And so for this exhibition, I wanted to focus on this cultural event that happens on my reservation, which is located in Montana, near the Wyoming border. We have this cultural event called Crow Fair, and originally it was started in 1904 as a way for the US government to assimilate us from a hunting and gathering society into a farming culture. They wanted us to utilize our reservation land and start farming it. There was a lot of pressure from settlers who wanted to start leasing our land. And so the Indian agent who resided on our reservation decided that maybe this might be a good idea to have us participate in a fair that would be modeled after the really popular fairs that were happening in the Midwest, in which we would bring to that fair all our harvests, show off our prized livestock. The women would can goods and make crafts. But knowing us, who we are as the Apsáalooke Nation, that would be a hard sell. So what the Indian agent decided would be necessary to get us to participate would be to lift some of the bans that were happening to all Native people around that time across the country, which was anything that promoted culture, our own culture. And so with that, they lifted some of the bans, and we were able to include some dancing at Crow Fair. And another thing that we did was a parade that would happen around the fair. And the fair is an encampment, basically, where we would go to this town on a reservation called Crow Agency and set up camp, and then the fair would happen there. And so this parade went around the encampment. And then around World War II, the government lost interest in it, and we fully took over and really turned it into a way, like a cultural revival, a way for us to immerse ourselves deeply into the culture for a week. It's a week-long event. And I've been participating in this my entire life. My grandparents have their entire life. My grandma was born in 1920. My grandpa was born in 1907. And so it has this really rich history. And we had our 100th Crow Fair a couple years ago. Unfortunately, we didn't have Crow Fair last August. It happens every third week in August because of the pandemic. So for this project, I decided I wanted to focus specifically on that parade that happens every morning and do a timeline that would trace the decades of that parade through photos, starting with my own personal family photos to historical archives. And so what you're looking at is part of the timeline. And I would pull from historical societies and any museum collection that had photos and that pertain to crows, and then look into those collections to see if they had images that were about Crow Fair. And then I would collect them, print them to create this timeline. And so with this timeline, another thing that I did was I would write directly on the wall. If I could ID people, I would ID people. If I wanted to talk about a specific object, I would write about that. Or if I knew a name of a horse, I would write down the name, or anything that really kind of caught my interest. Here is another detail. The woman, this young woman who's sort of in a black dress with dots, that's actually our traditional elk-tooth dress. That is my grandma. Her name is Amy Brightwings Red Star. And so this is around the 1920s, a section of the timeline. And here is the 90s. Most of these photos were taken by my mom and my dad and aunts, maybe some uncles. And the 90s were kind of big for me. I participated as a Crow Fair princess. So there's a lot of different various photos of me participating in different aspects during that decade. And these smaller photos, this is the 80s going into the 70s. These smaller photos are actually photos that my father took, and they were originally slides. This little girl in the black dress, that's my daughter, Beatrice. And this is a video, but I want to just pull out a section of the video. Bear with me here for a second. Just want to pause right here. And I'm pausing right here because I want to talk about this elderly woman. Her name is Winona Plentyhoops. And I selected this particular image of her based on the way that she's dressed. And it was really important for me because the way she's dressed is what we consider this sort of old school style of dressing. And it's a style when I was growing up on the reservation that I would typically see a selection of Crow women, and even men had an old style way of dress. And that generation was my grandma's generation. And now when I return home, nobody dresses this way. So it was really important for me seeing this image to hold on to it. And on this old school way of dressing, the women typically make their own very simple dresses. They wear these leather high top moccasins. They usually wear a leather belt that is got designs, either floral designs or geometric designs. And then they have a scarf around their head or neck. Sometimes they carry with them a blanket or a shawl. And so that was important. And then another thing I like to point out about Winona Plentyhoops is her son used to be the bass player in my dad's rock band called the Maniacs, which was an all Crow Indian rock band. So after putting together this timeline and having it in this space, there were some amazing moments that would happen. I just want to stop. Let's see. Give me a second here. No. I'm going to go back just a tiny bit. There's some amazing moments to have it all up that were unexpected to me. And one of them was seeing Winona Plentyhoops show up in 1910 as a little girl. So that was something that was really fun to be able to kind of crisscross through the space and see things that would sort of pop up in, you know, the first part, 1904, and I could see in 2016 when I started the timeline. And that really gave me a real sense of hope in that we are maintaining our culture. And that was something that was so refreshing to see that come out of this project. And so this is the start of the timeline. And that is my daughter. And she's sort of looking off into the distance. And I thought it was a perfect image. It was shot on, I think, my iPhone. And I like that she's sort of looking off to the distance, and it's sort of a reference for me of her continuing on this tradition of going to Crow Fair and immersing herself in the culture. But she wrote this wonderful poem around the time that she was this age, which must have been around 7, that I'd like to share with you. It's titled I Am, a poem by Beatrice. And it says, I am Crow Indian. I wonder when I will learn to shawl dance. I hear the sound of the powwow drums. I see my shawl hit my elk tooth dress. I want a unicorn. I am Crow Indian. I pretend I know the next step in grand entry. I feel the beat of the hot summer sun. I touch the elk tooth on my dress. I worry that I will miss a step. I cry when the sun hits my skin. I am Crow Indian. I understand that I can't open the bundle with the rock in it. I say my crow name. I dream about riding a unicorn. I try to be the best I can be. I hope that I can dance forever. I am Crow Indian. And I thought that was just like such a perfect start that really kind of captured this experience for me and being part of the culture. And a mix of sort of also just being a kid, which was really wonderful. This cultural event, Crow Fair, is a huge inspiration for my work. And so I've based a lot of projects off of Crow Fair, and another project came out of Crow Fair called Accession, which I produced in 2019. I did an artist residency, which Bea participated in. I'll talk about that, her participation, a little bit later in the talk. But in this artist residency at the Denver Art Museum, I was really interested. It was in conjunction with the Native galleries and working with them because they have an amazing crow collection. And I wanted to work with that crow collection. I wanted to see every object that they had from my community. And so here's a table of some of those objects that they pulled from me. And if you've never had an opportunity to see sort of the underbelly or collections at an institution, and it's pretty wild, especially if it's cultural objects or objects from your own community. Every time when I'm able to see objects, I often think of home and really wanting my community to have access and to see. And I often will call up my dad. Here's a photo of me holding a cradle board, and then these beautiful beaded blanket strips. So I asked the museum if they would share with me any photos of beadwork that had floral designs on it. And so they were sending stuff to me in email of beadwork, but what would also come up were these illustrations, these really beautiful drawings. And so I asked them, what's going on with these drawings? And they said, oh, those are our original catalog cards. And I was still confused. And I said, well, I'd really love to see these because they were depictions of crow beadwork. And so they showed me the original catalog cards. And this is what this slide is showing you. And during the Works Progress Administration, they hired local artists from the Denver community to come and do a project with the museum to draw each object in the Native collection and also the African collection on their catalog cards. And then the other side would have all the information about that object, when it came into the collection and anything else. And so they were these amazing watercolor drawings. So here's some examples of these beautiful illustrations. And I wanted to know more about the artists, but since the museum really considered this to be a job, they didn't record any of the artists' names. So that was very intriguing to me. Here's another example of an actual object with an illustration. And the other thing that I was feeling sort of kind of a little bit a tinge of jealousy, and that these unknown artists got to spend that intimate time with my community's objects and spend time with those makers, the Apsáalooke makers of those objects, and get to know them through their making. So I asked the museum if I could do a project with these accession cards. And one of the things or the feelings that I get whenever I go through a Native gallery or any collection of objects from another community, I realize that just the amount of information that I know about my community's objects when they're displayed in an institution. I know that when I'm looking at other cultures' objects, I'm missing so much information because it's out of context. And I decided I wanted to illustrate that, talk about that. So I took the cards back home during Crow Fair, and I found parade riders that were utilizing some of the objects that were depicted on the cards and paired them with the illustrations. So this is my father and my daughter, and the illustration is a wedding blanket, and the wedding blanket is draped over my daughter's lap on the horse. So it takes a little bit of work to look at these. And this is a beaded floral belt, and I thought this was really great. This young parade rider is using a very similar style beaded floral belt as a breast collar on his horse. This is a pair of beaded cuffs, and this young parade rider is wearing the beaded cuffs on his forearm. It's a typical style that men wear in Crow dress. And then this illustration is a beaded saddlebag, and you can see that saddlebag depicted behind the woman on the horse and child. And so here is some of these prints on view at Sergeant Stotter's Gallery in New York City. And so I made, I believe, around 15 of these prints. So around 2014, I had an exhibition, a solo exhibition at the Portland Art Museum. And there was a lot of discussion at that time that I was very interested in pertaining to cultural appropriation with Native imagery and Native images being commercialized. And so I started thinking about that and if that related in any way to Apsáalooke images. And instantly I thought of this chief named Medicine Crow. And I left my reservation at age 18 to attend college. And when I left, these two images have sort of followed me wherever I've gone. And so these are, this is Medicine Crow. And when I say they followed me, this is what I mean. Like here is one of those images on a book. I think this was a few years ago, going through an airport at an airport bookshop. And then when I was a graduate student at UCLA, I used to go to Whole Foods just so I could buy Honest Tea because he was also on Honest Tea. And in a way, it was very comforting for me. I was the only Native student in the UCLA art department. And so I would just have my Honest Tea and I could look over at Medicine Crow. But it wasn't until 2014 that I started really thinking about those two images again. And I hadn't ever really questioned what was going on in those two images. I just saw Medicine Crow. There are descendants of Medicine Crow that carry his name. And so that's what I did. I just simply asked a question like, well, what happened that day when he sat down to take that photo? And what I learned was that it was a delegation photo, and it wasn't just Medicine Crow who was in this delegation. There were 5 other Crow chiefs, and it was taken in 1880 by this guy, Charles Milton Bell. And the Crow delegation went from Montana to Washington, D.C. to sit with the president then, because the US government was trying to put a train through a large tract of our hunting territory. So we were there to really fight for the culture and fight for the land. And so now I have a very different perspective of those images. And I just want to say one thing. I didn't know anything about Native delegation portraits. So that's something that came out of asking this question. So if you Google 1900 Native delegation portraits, you'll see that there are so many different Native nations that traveled to Washington, D.C. And there was actually an industry that was sort of built up around that. So after seeing that, knowing this information, I started looking into each of these chiefs. And one of the things that I was very interested in was what they were wearing. I was familiar with what they are wearing. Some men at Crow Fair still wear similar items, but I didn't really ever dig into it. And what I learned was what they were actually stating through their clothing is how they became a chief. And there are 4 things in order to become a Crow chief. And they are to be the first in battle to touch an enemy warrior, snatching a weapon from an enemy in hand-to-hand combat, stealing a horse from within an enemy camp, and leading a successful war party. And those were really hard things to do. They weren't easy. They had to be witnessed. And they were considered great honors. And so this is 2 photos of Old Crow. And on his outfit, I can point out a few things. He's wearing these white ermine. Those are those long white things hanging off his arms. And those would represent that he stole a gun from an enemy. The various feathers represent certain coups, like that he touched an enemy. He was the first to touch an enemy in battle. The ermine on his pants represent that he stole a horse. And so everything that's on there would be some sort of honor that he obtained that would be known to our community, and other people on the plains would also have some sort of understanding that he was a great war chief. So I ended up taking these delegation portraits. So each chief had individual delegation portraits and outlining them in red. And the reason why I did that was I realized I wasn't really seeing these images, really seeing them. And by outlining them, it really forced me to look at all the intimate details down to the brass rings that he's wearing. And then that way I could really see. And then the other thing I would do is I started researching each of these men individually. And that information I would then write down on their portrait, things that really stuck out to me. So in 1885, the Crow census, he was 50 years old when this picture was taken. And he was the oldest member on this particular delegation trip. But he also attended the very first Crow delegation, which happened in 1873. So the picture on the left is him with his wife, Pretty Medicine Pipe, I believe, might be getting that wrong. And then there's a group portrait of the very first Apsáalooke delegation. And he's on the right side of that picture, and his wife is sitting on the ground. And I mentioned very early on about an Indian agent who started Crow Fair. The guy in the top hat is our very first Indian agent, and his name is Agent Pease. And so when the US government was putting Native people, confining them to reservations, they would have government hired agents, and they were called Indian agents to oversee Native people. So his name is Agent Pease, and there are still Pease that are married, and he actually had a Crow wife, and there's descendants, and one of the descendants started the Little Bighorn Community College on our reservation. So looking into each of these chiefs, I learned so much. Things that I just started to connect all sorts of dots. So for instance, this is Pretty Eagle. And one of the things I learned about him was when he was buried, his body was stolen, along with several other Crow remains. There was a big interest in like analyzing people of color's bones and studying them. So his remains were stolen from his gravesite, and they ended up at the American Museum of Natural History. And that was interesting last year with all the statues that were coming down, the monuments, and the Theodore Roosevelt statue that came down that is in front of the American Museum of Natural History, that's flanked by a Native person and an enslaved person. And so in the 90s, our community was able to get Pretty Eagle's remains back, and he's actually buried underneath this teepee structure, bronze teepee structure. And this is sort of a view that you would see if you visit where he's buried, and it's called Pretty Eagle Point. And growing up, I knew about Pretty Eagle Point. I didn't know he was buried there. I just thought that was Pretty Eagle Point. And it wasn't until I did the research here that I really learned what the meaning, the deep meaning of Pretty Eagle Point. So some of the chiefs I knew about, like I grew up knowing about Pretty Eagle and Medicine Crow, but Two Leggings was the chief I never knew about. So that was really wonderful to learn about him. But one of the great discoveries was this beautiful jacket that he's wearing. It's a floral beaded jacket with he's got otter fur trim. And I was able to look at the Crow objects at the Portland Art Museum, and they happen to have a very similar style Crow jacket. And this was one of those occasions where it really made you realize like the vibrancy of what you're sort of missing within these sepia tone or black and white photos. And so I placed that in that exhibition, and there is Two Belly standing in the background there. Oops. This is our last official chief of our community. His name is Pleniku, and he died in the 30s. And when they went to Washington, DC, the delegation was there for 2 months. And they were, to occupy some of that time, they were taken on trips, or they had them do certain things. And one of the trips they went on was a trip to Mount Vernon. And that really stuck with Pleniku. So the picture on the right is Mount Vernon, which is Washington's estate. And I actually had the opportunity to go and visit. I had a Smithsonian Research Artist Fellowship a couple years ago, and I made sure that I went to Mount Vernon to check it out. And I have a personal connection to Chief Pleniku. Where I grew up on the reservation is a town called Pryor, and that's where Chief Pleniku is from. And I lived about 5 miles away from that. But the other connection I have with him is he was so impressed with Mount Vernon that he wanted to build a miniature Mount Vernon on our reservation. So right before he died, he donated his land allotment, which had his log cabin house, to the state of Montana to turn into a state park that would be like a Mount Vernon. But in his version of Mount Vernon, it would be a place for other cultures to come and learn about the Crows in our culture. And I managed that park for a year. And it has a visitor center. It has his family's gravesite, and his grave is there. There's an apple orchard that he planted but yeah, I just got a little kick out of actually going to the Mount Vernon that inspired his miniature Mount Vernon. And then after all those years of having those two images that kept following me around, I realized that there were multiple images from other positions that were taken of medicine crows. So here are two other photos. And this particular delegation trip was really amazing to study because there's a ton of information. There's a lot of documents that are associated to this delegation. And one of the amazing documents that I found that's associated with this delegation are these drawings that were encouraged by this government agent named Charles H. Barstow. And he worked on the Apsáalooke reservation. And he had this sort of ongoing practice where when crows would come to do business, if they were waiting, he would supply them with paper and ask them to draw their various experiences. And so when Medicine Crow came back from Washington, D.C., he asked him to draw his trip from memory. And so there are these amazing drawings that Medicine Crow drew, and just like all the news about the Capitol, I kept thinking about like Medicine Crow's drawing. And I know the Capitol was just like recently kind of new by the time that that delegation was there visiting in 1880. So here are some boats. 3 different types of trains. And then, like I said, they were trying to occupy that 2 months of time. And another thing that they experienced is one of the first circuses. And so Medicine Crow drew some of the animals that he saw, and some of these animals don't exist in Crow country. So he also came up with names. So all the writing is actually Barstow's writing. But the peacock is, he called it Wonder Tail Comes From Above. And I really love that. Sort of gives you kind of an insight into an Apsáalooke perspective. So here are some more drawings. So I tend to get obsessed. That's a big part of my art practice, is getting really kind of an obsession with a particular interest. And for a while, it was these circus drawings. And part of it was like a real need of wanting to have these, make them tangible, wanting them not to just exist digitally. And so there was an advertisement that was going around where you could take children's drawings and then turn them into a soft toy. And so I thought, well, why don't I take this elk with a big back on him, or a camel, and submit it to this company and see what happens. And then this is what happened. And it was great. It was like a surprise in the mail. And I thought, well, I'm just going to continue this interesting collaboration. So this is a big snake with legs. And then a lion, or, yeah, we have mountain lions. So I think it translates to the same. Dog and man, or monkey. And the zebra, which I love, because after him memorizing so much information, this particular animal, he forgot that it had stripes and gave it dots. I also love that he stuck the river up there in the top right corner. That to me is also very like fascinating. So if you are interested in learning more about this particular delegation, I had a wonderful opportunity to work with the research associate in the American wing at the Met, Shannon Victoria, to go more in depth about this particular delegation and the photographer, Charles Milton Bell, and the first-hand accounts from these chiefs, and it's on Panorama, so it's available. And this work is currently, an iteration of this work is currently on view at MassMocha's Kid Space in the exhibition Wendy Red Star, Apsáalooke, Children of the Large-beaked Bird. There's also this, it's in the kids space, so it's geared towards children, and there's curriculum to be shared that you can share with kids. And then speaking of that, out of that Portland Art Museum exhibition in 2014, an amazing collaboration happened with my daughter, who was 7 at the time. And I was trying to think of a way to round out the exhibition, finish it up, and I needed one more piece to help me do that. And at that time, I had a bunch of Xerox copies of each of the chiefs that I was using to write on, and my daughter was with me and she wanted to play. And so I just gave her a stack of the chiefs and didn't think anything about it. And then she came back with this beautiful drawing over the top of Medicine Crow. And to me, that made so much sense to see if she wanted to make more of these drawings and participate in the exhibition, that this work would be the closing to make the show all come together. It's about, it's really about the next generation, and then knowing this history, and also just taking it on, I would say. So I set her up with a little studio, and here is her work. And then on the way to the museum, she asked if she could talk about her work, which was frightening because she was 7. And I said yes. And she did an amazing job. She has a gift for public speaking. So she talked about her drawings and also the zoo animals. And then from there on, I realized that I had been sort of separating, artist in my career with being a parent. And I realized I didn't really have to do that. Like this could be a journey or that we could take on together, and she could join me. She could see what I'm doing, and then she could also learn about her own culture and participate. So it started with that exhibition. This is her and her class. She gave a tour of the entire exhibition. And then from there on, if I got an opportunity to have a show, I would ask, I'd talk to her about it if she was interested, and then I would ask the institution if I could include her. And so we actually did collaborative portraits in this exhibition, Contemporary Native Photographers and the Edward Curtis Legacy. We created 4 portraits called Apsáalooke Feminist. And Edward Curtis, he's a photographer around the turn of the century who was on a mission to photograph as many indigenous nations as possible because he thought we were all going to vanish. So he wanted to photograph us before we became extinct or not authentic or too assimilated. And he came and he photographed the crow. But what I noticed when I had access to all his materials on my community is that he really left out women. And that was sort of the focus of the time of the anthropologists. Wasn't really focused on women. It was focused on warriors and chiefs and that sort of thing. And so my community is matrilineal and we have a clan system. And so I wanted to talk about that aspect. So I created this work with Bee called Apsáalooke Feminist. And Bee did also talked about this work. And I mentioned earlier in this lecture about doing Bee did the residency with me at the Denver Art Museum. And for this, she wanted to develop her own tours specifically for children that came to the museum. And so we set her up with her own little badge and then let her loose in the museum to select artworks for her tour. And then we gave her a little education on those artworks and artists. And she developed 3 30-minute tours that focus on the Native galleries and I think the Western art galleries. And she became so invested in this idea of being a tour guide that she drew for me a picture of herself in a tour guide outfit that she wanted. So this is her drawing. And then I, to the best of my ability, tried to sew her up her drawing. So there she is. And here she is giving some of her tours. And then we hit this really great spot in our collaboration where, you know, when it started out, I was pitching 2 places, if I could please collaborate with my child, to where institutions were reaching out to us and asking if we would come together as a collaboration. And one of those institutions was the Tang Teaching Museum. And for this project, I decided I would teach Bee exactly how to make this artwork that I made in 2006 when I was in graduate school called The 4 Seasons. And The 4 Seasons was based on this experience that I had going to the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles because I was missing home. And I knew, and I basically made a bet with myself that if I go there, I bet there's some Crow items. And I was right. And so the way that that institution was set up then was you walked through this dinosaur exhibit that was very dramatic and dark. And then you walked into these also dramatic and dark Native galleries. And that's where I saw the moccasins and I realized that we were being set up. Like the museum goers were being set up to place Native peoples in the past. It's not a living, breathing culture that exists today. And so I decided I wanted to kind of put that all together, that feeling and that experience. So I produced the 4 seasons, these dioramas, and placed myself within them. So the idea was that Bee would create her own seasons and she'd be like an apprentice where I would show her every single thing I did to make this work. So here she is at the museum. She selected all the animals in the backdrop, astroturf and the flowers, and did the installation and realized, you know, it's tiring, it's hard work. And then it flipped. Instead of her posing, she actually took photos of museum goers. They would come and they would pose, and then she would photograph them. And then she decided she wanted to retire at age 11. And so this is her and her last tour at the Pulitzer and St. Louis. And she gave a tour of their exhibit on Ruth Asawa. And that was just a really wonderful chapter in my art career. And I really look forward to hearing her thoughts, you know, when she gets older on that adventure that we took together. She still totally has an opinion on everything I do, but she's definitely in her retirement at age 13. She's 13 now. So my upcoming work, I just a few months ago completed my 3rd time doing this residency at Crow Shadow Institute for the Arts. It's one of my favorite artist residency It's a residency that was founded by an artist named James Lavador, who is a member of the Umatilla Nation. And Crow Shadow is located on the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and it's a printmaking residency where you get to work with a master printmaker. And I just think James Lavador is just like a genius. He's incredible. It's wonderful that he's bringing artists to his community, and that the community gets to see these artists, but then also the artists get to know the community as well. And so for this particular residency, I was really interested, and I'm interested currently in genealogy and doing genealogy work. And then the other thing with working with a master printmaker is that it's a true collaboration, and that I'm really kind of an idea maker, and they don't even allow me to mix the colors. So it's also a practice of me kind of letting go. And here is them working with this print to put on these photos of some of my family. It's very tedious work. Just show this video. So I was able to complete 3 lithographs, color trial proofs that will be in production, I believe, this spring. And so this one is 4 generations. I'm there on the top left. Over to the top right is my grandma. Down below her is my daughter, and across from my daughter is my father. This is my great-great-grandfather. His name is Dust. And my great-great-grandma, her name is Her Dreams Are True. And then the last project I want to talk about, which is open now at the Joslin Museum, is based on the 1898 Indian Congress, which was a convening of over 30 Native nations during Nebraska's Trans-Mississippi Exposition, which happened in Omaha, Nebraska, August 4th to October 31st in 1898. And I became interested because I was very aware of Frank Reinhardt, this photographer who's based in Omaha, and his photos of crows. So there's some amazing photos of crows that he took. And so when I was invited to do an exhibition at the Joslin, I asked them if I could focus on Frank Reinhardt. And so they invited me to do a research trip out there. Here's a picture of Frank. This is the only photo that I could find, and it's him going to a masquerade party dressed up as Napoleon. So I don't know, sense of humor maybe. And so for this research trip, we just kind of wanted to get to know Frank Reinhardt, and also research the grounds of where the Trans-Mississippi Exposition happened, and also where the Indian Congress was located within that exposition. And we went for it. We found Frank Reinhardt's burial plot. And then we also went to the building where Frank's photo studio used to be, where he photographed many of the portraits of the Indian Congress. And then the Omaha Public Library has a large collection of those portraits that I was able to utilize and research for this project. And here's some of the images of my community up at the top. And so these were Native nations from all over, from the Southwest to Iowa to Crow Country. And to give you an example of what those studio portraits looks like, this is White Swan. He was a Crow scout, but he is also known as one of the first Crow Indian artists. And another important aspect of the Indian Congress was they had a bunch of Native interpreters. And so one of the Native interpreters for my community is this guy named Alexander Upshaw. He's very important because he actually, when Edward Curtis came to my reservation, he was the main interpreter for Edward Curtis. And I really attribute him to the reason why there's such great information in Edward Curtis accounts of my community and the photos that Edward Curtis was able to get because of Alexander Upshaw. So this is a photograph of my community at the exposition grounds. So they set up camp and different Native nations had their own dwellings. And it was like a living exhibit. So the other thing I did was I studied the images of the exposition itself. And I was really interested in like the displays and how they were displaying. It's basically like manifest destiny, right? They were in one way, you know, the Native people, the Indian Congress represented the old way, and how the exposition represented them pushing out Native people and industry. And so I was interested in those displays and sort of combining that display system with the Indian Congress. So what I did was I got copies of the Indian Congress, all of them, and then just started cutting them out. So another kind of amazing thing though with this project is that Frank Reinhardt a year later actually went to my reservation. I think it's because of Alexander Upshaw. So he went to my reservation, he went to Pryor, which is where I grew up. And just maybe less than a mile away, this is my father, this is where Frank Reinhardt photographed my community just a year later. And here is Frank Reinhardt's images in that area that my dad was pointing towards. There's just a small video, just I want to show you what that landscape looks like. So this is very important. That's where I grew up. Like I know that space intimately. This is my kid there. And those mountains are so important to us. So it was just kind of amazing to see that connection. And so I wanted to tell that complete story from Omaha to Crow Country, and also like the artifice of the Indian Congress to actually coming to our community, just photographing us on our land. You know, there's a very important sacred site where he photographed, which was behind him, that I'm sure he had to pay tribute to because we probably told him he had to. So here are some installation shots of the Indian Congress on the display units. And then at the back is a photograph that I took on my reservation where Frank Reinhardt was when he photographed in 1900. And to end, I'll end with this video. There's a few other things I need to share. This is so new to me. It got installed on January 30th, and it's a brand new work, and I'm still digesting it. There's so much information in this. But one of the things that I really appreciate Frank Reinhardt for is that he actually put almost everybody's name on the image, the women, the children. So that is pretty rare for the time. Usually they didn't put names to the image, and also the tribal affiliation. So I made sure when you're in there, you can see everybody's name and you can kind of see who's related to who. And so we kind of put everybody in the delegation. And the other thing, this was like truly my first virtual install. So the curator, her name's Annika Johnson, and also the Omaha exhibition team, they were incredible. And they were the ones who were sort of my hands and also my eyes who were putting this whole show together. So I'm incredibly grateful. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Okay, hello. Sorry, we had a little glitch there. I have some questions here. I don't know, Wendy, do you have a view of the Q&A as well?
No, but I can pull it open.
Okay, just in case. We have about 10 questions at the moment.
Okay.
Some I think you've covered, but start with the first one that came in about, do you have any feelings about how your culture has grown over time that weren't covered in there? I know that's a pretty broad question.
You know, I think the thing is that it's so strong. I guess that's when I think about growth with the culture, I think about resiliency. And that's the thing that I'm always kind of reminded of every time that especially when I'm looking into sort of these historical collections and archives, I'm just really kind of almost like physically punched by that we're still holding on. Even if I'm also confronted with feeling very sad that some of these things I won't ever know. The essence of the culture is still very strong, and it hasn't gone away. I mean, just to think about everything that has been done to Indigenous people to tell us we can't be who we are, and to see that we're still here and we're still participating in things that our ancestors were doing is just incredible. So I'd say, I don't know if that's growth.
Great. Well, good answer. I'm just going to kind of go through because we're running out of time here, but I have a question from Victor Torres that I'm just going to kind of sum up. He's basically asking, did your family or people close to you ever put you down for pursuing an art career? I think related to that, I was also wondering what the reception of the Crow people have been to your work.
Mm-hmm. I think as going into contemporary art, my family doesn't really know that much about contemporary art. I mean, they know like the basics. And so I think especially when I was going to UCLA, and I would say when they saw the Four Seasons, they were like, that's really weird. And so I think for a while they were like, kind of just thinking they didn't really know what to make of it. And I have a feeling all artists probably have that same thing if their family doesn't really know about the arts. The other thing is like something really major will happen to me in the art world, and I'll tell them. And since they don't know anything about the art world, they'll be like, oh, okay. And I'll be like, it's kind of big. In some way, I think it's really great because it's super humbling. And then regarding my community, it's just like every other community. You've got people who are really supportive, and then you've got people who aren't. And that's just the same everywhere.
Right. I have a question here from, oops, I just lost it. From Stephanie here had a question about your feelings of the depictions of the Crow by the older photographers such as Reinhardt and Curtis.
Mm-hmm.
You have a particular take on?
Yeah, by the time those Reinhardt and Curtis photographed my community. My community had been well photographed. So I think that's the thing that I don't think people take into account. So the first delegation photo was taken in 1873. I think the first known photograph of a crow was taken in 1850. Curtis came to my community around the early 1900s. We had it down and we wanted to be paid. So I think we knew like there's money in it, and so like you got to pay us. And so I think, yeah, we had a pretty good understanding of what that meant. So for me, I feel like I'm really kind of pulling from that aspect, especially growing up on the reservation and kind of knowing my community sense of humor. Like, I'm like, I can see she's totally, doing this or pick up on something like that. So I think there was a lot more agency within the sitters of those photographers.
Right. And I guess a follow-up to that was Katie Helm was wondering about your personal opinion of companies using the crow imagery, like the honest tea. Was it used with permission or stolen?
Yeah, I guess that was used with permission. It's so funny when I start doing things, sometimes I'll dig real deeply into something and not something else. So like that was just, I remember seeing it on Honest Tea and I didn't dig any further, but actually it was in conjunction with a crow company named Ikchik Tea. And so I guess money did go back to that crow company for something. So, and I just found that out like last year. Somebody alerted me to that.
Nice. Let me see. Okay, so here's a question from Yasmin about any resources you could recommend. She's doing a project on Indigenous peoples' land management and stewardship. Yeah, I guess anything you can recommend, any archives or things that you found really sort of fruitful in your research?
Ooh, for me, I really focus on my own community. So maybe that would be my advice. Maybe wherever you're based, maybe starting with the local community first as kind of the resource there and their history. And then that might lead you to an archive that might then lead you to something else.
Right. Question, it's a couple kind of technical questions. This might be too long for an answer, but one was about like the pattern in the back of your print work, the prints that you were doing at the crow shadow. I think the star pattern.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so star quilts are so popular, I'd say, for Plains communities. And of course, they were brought in by settler culture, and then we adopted them. And there's a very kind of specific style or aesthetic of a star quilt for Plains communities that is very familiar to me. But the reason why I use it is because we have a thing in my community called giveaways. It's where somebody will give away to their clan aunts and uncles. It's a way to honor. And if you really want to show out, you'll give them a star quilt. That's kind of like a coveted thing. So for me, like talking about my genealogy is trying to represent a background that is so important that I want to show out in. So that's why I chose the star quilt for the work that I'm doing with genealogy.
Great. I think we have time for just one more. I'm going to kind of collapse a couple here. I think just as your decision-making process, you're sort of very transdisciplined. You're as much a curator and researcher as you are an artist. Do you have a specific methodology that you go back to, or how do you get from one medium to another? Maybe unpack that in a general sense.
I think it's always about the visual. I think a photo, even though I come from both my undergrad and graduate as a sculpture background, I think a photo is always driving me. It's always about the story. So it always starts with the visual, asking questions. Questions take me on some incredible adventure. And then through that, it's just like, what is the best way to present this research? And sometimes that, and I don't want that to be limited. So that's why there's such a range. And then the other thing is, for me, it's a big part about getting people to kind of see things differently, or pay attention to a detail. So I'll cut things out or point to things by outlining. So that's very important to me. And then bottom line, I just want empathy and relating on a human to human level. So that's kind of the end game for me.
Great. Well, I think that's a great ending too. I think we've all really enjoyed it. The chat just kind of blew up with great comments. People really enjoyed the lecture. And I think we'll end it there. I just want to let people know that we have another Visual Voices lecture with Rosille coming up on the 25th of February. So please check in there. And there's some exhibition links, website links in the chat. So thank you, Wendy. Thank you everyone for joining us. And good night.
Thank you. Good night.